I used to believe nothing ever rose from the depths of Silvermist Lake. But then one winter morning, a soaked black dog stood at my doorstep and its eyes were Luna's. The dog that drowned with my daughter 18 years ago. I had buried that memory, forced myself to believe Clara was gone. But night after night, the dog led me back to the lake, to the shimmer of strange light beneath the wreckage of an old boat. And then, a rusted underground wall revealed itself, scratched with one word: Clara. If you think this is just a story about death, you're wrong. This is a whisper from the dark. A truth the whole town tried to bury, until a four-legged soul unearthed it. Subscribe now to follow our gripping story films, where every moment pulses with suspense, sorrow, and the promise of hope. Under the bone-pale light of an early winter dawn, the world around Silvermist Lake held its breath. The trees stood stiff like forgotten soldiers, their branches encased in brittle ice, and the lake itself long since frozen over. In memory murmured beneath a thin sheet of frost, like it was keeping a secret it no longer wanted to hold. It was the kind of cold that didn't just touch the skin. It crawled under it, settled behind the ribs, and waited. Inside a creaking wooden cabin, a man stirred from sleep. Not because he wanted to, but because something in the dream had pulled him up by the spine. Robert Callahan sat up, heart-pounding, sheets damp with the sweat of something older than fear. He hadn't dreamt in years. Not really. Not since that night, not since the lake took Clara. But this wasn't just a dream. He could still hear it, her voice faint and far, like wind slipping through window panes, calling across the water, Dad. One word drawn out like a whisper, like a plea. Then came the image, just as it always did, but this time clearer, sharper. A boat rocking in midnight black water, tipping as a small hand reached out. Moonlight on soaked hair. A flash of teeth. Was she screaming or smiling? And then nothing. A deep final gulp of the lake, swallowing her whole. 18 years, and the dream still knew exactly how to knock the wind out of him. Robert rubbed his hands over his face, rough with days-old stubble and skin grown leathery from too many winters alone. The house creaked. Not a ghost, not the wind. Just the way old wood talked to itself when no one else would. He rose slowly, joints protesting, and made his way to the kitchen, where the coffee pot waited, like it always did, unplugged, untouched. He didn't bother with it. There wasn't much left inside him that could be warmed. The morning outside had gone silent. No birds, no motors across the lake, just that kind of unnatural quiet that made you think the world had stepped outside for a smoke and forgot to come back. Then came the knock, not a real one. More like the sound of claws on woodlight and rhythmic. Robert paused mid-step. The knock came again, closer, to a scrape this time. He opened the door. At first he thought it was a shadow, just a trick of the trees. But then the shadow moved. A black dog stood at the edge of his porch. Its fur was soaked, dripping despite the dry air, and steam curled off its back in long ghostly strands. It didn't bark, didn't growl, just stared. Its eyes were what did it. Amber, pale and knowing. Luna's eyes. Robert's breath caught in his throat like a fishhook. He gripped the doorframe, sudden dizziness, making the floor pitch under him. It couldn't be her. Luna was dead. Drowned. Gone. But this dog, this thing, looked like a memory carved out of ice. He didn't speak. Just held the dog's gaze, his heart thundering so loud it muffled the wind. The dog didn't move. Then slowly it walked forward up the 3 wooden steps, claws clicking with the weight of something heavy, and sat right at his door. Robert blinked once, twice. The dog's eyes never left him. Not even when he crouched down. Not even when he whispered the name that made his mouth taste like rust. Luna. The dog didn't react. But something shifted. A feeling more than a sound. Something low and vibrating in the bones, as if the name had tugged on a string buried deep in the floorboards of the earth. No collar, no tags, just thick matted fur and that wet, impossible stare. He reached out. The dog didn't flinch. His fingers touched damp fur, warm, alive. It wasn't Luna. It couldn't be, but it was close enough that something cracked inside his chest. He opened the door wider. The dog walked in. The house felt colder the moment it crossed the threshold. Not a drop in temperature, something stranger. The way a funeral home always feels colder, even when the heat's on. Something about death, even years gone, changes the air. The dog padded to the fireplace and lay down without hesitation. Robert stood there a long moment, door still open, wind blowing snow across his boots. Then he shut it. He didn't want to name the dog, didn't want to let it stay, didn't want to acknowledge that it had found him, not the other way around. But the name crept up anyway, uninvited and certain. "Shadow," he said it out loud, without meaning to. The dog's ears twitched. That was all. Shadow, because that's all that was left now. No wife, no daughter, no real reason to keep breathing, except the muscle memory of it. But Shadow had come, somehow, and something inside Robert moved for the first time in years. He went to the sink and filled a bowl with water. Set it down. The dog drank in silence. Not ravenous, not timid. Just measured like it knew it had time. That night, Robert didn't dream. He didn't need to. Shadow did it for him. Sometime around midnight, the dog stood by the front door, tail still ears forward. A low whine escaped its throat, not fearful, not urgent, just expectant. Robert didn't know why he followed, just that he couldn't not. He threw on a flannel jacket, grabbed a flashlight out of habit, and stepped into the cold. Shadow led him. No leash, no command. Just a quiet determination, each paw fall deliberate. Down the slope behind the house, through the thickets of pine, past the stone where Robert used to sit and throw sticks into the lake for Luna. The path remembered them, even if Robert had tried to forget. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, thin ice over the surface, silver veins running across black glass. Shadow stopped, right at the old dock. The dock had sagged with time, warped under snow and neglect. One of the boards had split clean through last spring. Robert had never fixed it. Shadow walked to the edge, stared out at the water, didn't move, didn't sit, just stood there still as death. Robert joined him. He hadn't stood on this dock since the day after they found Luna's collar tangled in a fishing net. No body, no trace, just the collar, and a little pink sneaker. The wind picked up. From somewhere in the trees, an owl called long and low. Shadow didn't look away from the lake, and that was when Robert saw it. A shimmer, under the ice, not light, not quite, a ripple, a glow, like something was pulsing beneath the surface. And in that moment, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Robert felt something he hadn't dared let himself feel. Dread. Because that shimmer, it wasn't new. He'd seen it once before, the night Clara vanished. The air turned bitter. The kind that burns your lungs and makes your eyes water. He took a step back. Shadow stayed. Didn't move, just stared. The kind of stare that says, you know, you remember. Don't pretend you don't. Robert stumbled back to the cabin in the dark, flashlight off, footsteps uneven, like something in him had tilted permanently off center. Shadow returned 20 minutes later, covered in frost paws, soaked. It curled up beside the cold fireplace. Didn't look at him. Didn't need to. Robert sat in the armchair, both hands clenched around a bottle he hadn't planned to open. He didn't drink. Not yet. Just watched the dog. Watched the way it twitched in its sleep, like it was dreaming. Of boats, maybe? Of little girls calling out in the dark. Of things that weren't supposed to come back, but had. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, a man who'd forgotten how to hope began to remember how to be afraid. The first time Shadow led him there, Robert thought it was coincidence. The second night, he wasn't so sure. By the third, he followed willingly, coat zipped to the chin, flashlight in one hand, thermos untouched in the other. Shadow moved like he'd lived these woods longer than any man ever had. Taking turns down half-buried trails, pausing when the ice cracked somewhere in the trees, always headed in the same direction, toward the lake, toward what remained of the old dock, toward the water where the boat went under. 18 years ago, 18 years since Clara had disappeared into the night like breath on a window pane. 18 years since they declared her dead without a body. 18 years since Luna had gone with her. And yet here he was again, drawn back like a string tied to the heart. Shadow would stop at the edge of the water and stare silent, unmoving, his breath fogging the air in slow, deliberate clouds. Robert stood beside him, each time the chill biting into his fingers, despite the gloves, his boots sinking slightly in the frost-stiff mud. Each time Robert felt the weight of something pressing against his chest. Each time he waited for something to happen, and one night it did. It started as a glimmer no bigger than the nail of his thumb, just beneath the surface of the ice. A faint pulsing light that didn't reflect from the moon or catch from the flashlight. It glowed from inside the water, slow and steady, like a dying heartbeat. Robert took a step forward. The ice didn't creak. The lake had frozen thick this year, but he still hesitated. There was something unnatural about the light. It didn't ripple or shift like a flashlight might. It pulsed, rhythmic, measured. Shadow let out a low sound, not a growl, more of a breath with tension behind it. Robert knelt down at the edge, squinting, trying to see deeper through the cloudy ice. He couldn't make out a shape, just the source of the light. He pulled back before his mind could convince his hand to touch it. Back inside the cabin, he couldn't sleep. Shadow curled up near the hearth again, but Robert paced like a man waiting for bad news. Something was scratching at the inside of his skull. Something half buried. And then the dreams returned. Same lake, same voice, but different this time. This time Clara wasn't calling. She was whispering. wet hair clinging to her face, lips moving underwater. But he could still hear her. Under the boat, Dad. He woke up with blood in his mouth. He'd bitten his own tongue. The next morning, he shaved for the first time in 3 weeks. He didn't know what he was doing, just that he couldn't sit still. Shadow watched from the doorway, head cocked slightly like he already knew what Robert would decide before Robert did. Later that afternoon, while feeding the dog, Robert noticed something odd. A ridge behind Shadow's left ear. Just beneath the fur, too smooth to be scar tissue, too firm to be fat or bone. He brushed the fur aside. Shadow flinched just a bit, then went still. A scar. A precise surgical scar barely visible. And underneath it, a bump. It took him 30 minutes and a pair of rusted tweezers to get a better look. The fur around it was matted strangely, as if it had been recently trimmed and regrown. Beneath that metal, his heart paused. He pressed gently and felt it shift something embedded. Rounded edges, maybe coin-sized. It wasn't a cyst. It was something implanted. He stared at Shadow like he was seeing him for the first time. "What the hell are you?" he muttered. He ran inside and pulled open a long-forgotten drawer in the hallway. He found what he was looking for, an old pet microchip scanner from his days working rescue before the grief had taken everything else. Batteries dead, of course. He tore apart 2 flashlights before finding fresh ones. When he ran the scanner over Shadow's neck, it beeped high and sharp. ID found 7422X1932. No name, no registry, just a string of numbers. But the fact that the scanner picked it up at all told him one thing. This dog had been tracked. Someone had put a tracker in him. And trackers like this old model, government use, rare. Robert sat back on his heels, heart hammering. Shadow came from somewhere important. And someone years ago had gone to a lot of trouble to hide that fact. A memory flared in the back of Robert's mind. A detail he hadn't thought about in years. The day after Clara vanished, one of the divers who searched the lake had come back up pale as snow. Said he'd seen something down there, a box, a large metal container wedged under the wreckage of a boat. But it was too deep, too unstable. The current was all wrong. And then the search ended. Quietly. Too quietly. Robert never forgot the look on that diver's face. He never got to ask him more. The guy left town the next day. Now the dream made sense. Under the boat, Clara had whispered. Shadow wasn't just a stray. He was pointing. Robert poured himself a whiskey and didn't touch it. Let it sit untouched beside the sink while he picked up the phone. His fingers hovered over the keypad before punching the number in from memory. The phone rang 4 times before a gravelly voice answered. Callahan. Hey, Jimmy. A pause. I thought you were dead. Robert let out something between a laugh and a cough. Still deciding. Another pause. Then, what do you need? I need a boat. Sonar, maybe a camera rig. Jimmy exhaled loudly. You serious? I think there's something under the lake I missed. You mean like 18 years ago? Robert's voice dropped to a low hum. Yeah, exactly like 18 years ago. Jimmy didn't respond right away. When he did, the sarcasm was gone. I'll be there tomorrow. Robert hung up, hands shaking slightly. Shadow was still watching him. Still calm. Still knowing. Looks like we're going diving, Robert said. The dog didn't react, just blinked once. But Robert could have sworn he saw something like relief in that blink. Something that said, finally. That night, the dreams came hard and fast. The light under the lake, the whisper, the word Dad scraping across bone, and a collar, Luna's collar, rising to the surface like a dead thing trying to breathe again. He sat up in bed panting. The room was dark, but the front door was open. Wind blew in, and standing in the middle of it was Shadow eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. And clutched in his mouth, drenched and covered in a thin film of ice, was a collar. Old, rusted, the name tag worn smooth with time. But he knew it. He would have known it anywhere. Luna. Robert dropped to his knees. The collar clattered to the floor. His fingers brushed over it, and something inside him buckled. Because he hadn't seen this collar since the day they dragged that net out of the lake. Since they told him it was all that remained. But now it was here, wet, cold, and real. Shadow licked his hand once and walked back to the hearth. And Robert finally believed what he'd tried so hard not to. The lake had kept its secrets, but it wasn't done telling them. The past doesn't fade. It rusts. It clings to the underside of memories like barnacles on a hull. Sharp embedded, impossible to scrub clean. Robert Callahan knew this better than anyone, especially when the past didn't knock politely, but crawled through the walls in the quietest hour of the night. He was standing in the hallway now, staring at the closet door he hadn't opened in almost 2 decades. His hand hovered over the knob like it was the trigger of a weapon. Shadow watched from behind. Lying low ears, perked eyes glowing with quiet intent, as if he too remembered what was in there. As if he had been waiting for this. Robert took a breath. His fingers closed around the knob. The door creaked open. Inside, beneath the hanging coats and yellowed jackets, was a single cardboard box. It was unmarked, taped at the corners, dented where time had tried to eat through it. Robert knelt slowly, knees cracking, breath catching in his chest. He knew what was inside. He had always known. He carried it out to the dining table, set it down like it weighed more than it did. Shadow didn't follow. He stayed in the hall, just watching, like a sentry guarding sacred ground. The tape peeled like skin. Inside were things Clara had left behind before the night she vanished. A science fair ribbon, a cracked snow globe, a half-used sketchbook with tiny horses drawn in the corners, and underneath it all, the jacket, her favorite one, yellow with a hood shaped like bear ears. It was what she wore the last time he saw her, the one she refused to stop wearing even after it had gone tight around her arms. Robert reached in with both hands. The fabric had dried stiff, a cold stiffness that hadn't been there before. It took him a second to realize he was holding his breath. He unfolded the jacket slowly, turned it in his hands, and saw it. On the inside of the right sleeve, barely visible, unless you were looking for it, a brown stain darker than the rest of the aged cotton. Dried in place, a jagged line near the cuff. Blood. His stomach twisted. He remembered this part. The investigation. The day they returned it to him, carefully sealed in a plastic bag, said it had been caught on the rocks near the north side of the lake. Said it must have snagged as she went under. They told him it wasn't worth testing. The current would have diluted anything worth finding. And besides, there's no crime here, Mr. Callahan. It's just a drowning. He hadn't argued. He didn't have the strength. At the time, he'd barely had the strength to breathe. But now, his fingers pressed into the spot. He could feel the texture rougher than the rest of the fabric. Fibers warped by time and something else, something human. Someone had bled in this, and no one had cared. The memory cracked open, sudden and sharp. It was October 17th, 2005. He was in the station working the overnight shift. The power grid was failing in sections of the county routine enough. Calls coming in from cabins out near Copper Ridge. Nothing urgent. His phone had buzzed just once. Clara, 11:47 p.m. He hadn't answered. He was elbow deep in paperwork, arguing with dispatch about coverage zones, when the call came in. Not hers. A neighbor. Said Luna had come tearing down the trail alone, barking frantically. No Clara, just the dog. Soaked, whining. He hadn't even waited for protocol. He'd grabbed a flashlight, screamed something into the radio, and driven straight to the lake. The image was seared into him, forever. Clara's bike laid on its side, near the trailhead back tire, still spinning. Tiny footprints in the frost, half faded from where the wind had passed. Luna standing by the shore, barking toward the water tail, rigid ears flat. She'd looked at him like she was begging. He remembered the panic. The calls into the wind. The flashlight beam cutting through trees. Then the hours. The days. Search teams. Divers. Helicopters. Cadaver dogs. Nothing. No body. No clothes. No screams. Just absence. And then the decision, cold and procedural. After 72 hours with no signs of life, and given the temperature of the lake, we are obligated to initiate the paperwork to declare a presumptive drowning. Robert had stood in the sheriff's office with the paper in his hand and felt his legs go numb. The deputy, a kid barely out of academy, offered a gentle pat on the back, like that would do anything. Like a father was supposed to sign off on the death of his daughter, based on a theory. But he had. Because what choice did he have? Everyone told him to grieve, to accept, even when they couldn't find her, even when there were details that didn't make sense. The call he missed, the collar that showed up 2 days later in a fishing net too far from the current's usual flow, the vague responses from search leaders who suddenly stopped returning calls. But he let it go, or told himself he had. Until now. Now the jacket was in his lap, and the blood was there, and the dog with Luna's eyes had come back like a ghost with a mission. Robert stood his legs, trembling. He took the jacket to the sink, ran cold water over the stain. It didn't lift. Of course it didn't. It had been too long. But as the water soaked the sleeve, something loosened beneath the lining. A corner of fabric pulled away from the seam. A hidden pocket. He pulled gently, and out fell something small. A note, folded once. Water damaged, but legible. Scrawled in Clara's childlike handwriting. Dad, someone is watching me. Luna is scared. We're hiding in the boat. The breath left his lungs so fast he nearly fell. She had written this. That night. She hadn't just vanished. She'd known. She'd been afraid. And Luna had tried to help her. He leaned against this counter, the room spinning. Shadow stepped into the doorway, then paused quiet on the wood. Robert looked at him, no longer confused, no longer skeptical. Just hollow, raw. You knew. Shadow blinked. You knew she didn't drown. He dropped into the chair like the weight of the jacket had finally crushed him. The note trembled in his fingers. That boat, the one she wrote about. It had been found, overturned, lodged in the reeds. They'd pulled it ashore, assumed it was just kids playing rough. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just a splintered oar and some muddy prints they couldn't match. Robert had stood beside that hull and stared at the peeling blue paint, wondering if she'd ever touched it. And now he knew she had. She'd hidden in it, She'd written a goodbye inside a hidden pocket while some unholy thing circled the shore. He should have been there. He should have answered the damn phone. A sound escaped his throat, something between a sob and a growl. He gripped the edge of the table so hard the wood groaned beneath his hands. Shadow walked closer, rested his head against Robert's leg. The weight of it broke something loose in him. He didn't cry often, hadn't really since the funeral that never had a body. But now the tears came fast and hard, full of rage and guilt, and the unbearable realization that he'd let the truth go too quietly. His little girl had called him, and he hadn't picked up. Shadow didn't move, just stayed pressed close. The silence in the cabin grew thick like fog inside the lungs. When Robert finally spoke again, it came out hoarse bitter. They knew. His voice shook. Someone knew. Someone made sure this went away. He looked down at the note again. There was no signature, but there was a smudge on the edge. Fingerprint, maybe. He didn't know, but he was going to find out. He reached for the old scanner again. Ran it across Shadow's neck this time, searching deeper through the menu. The screen flickered, then displayed something he hadn't expected. Unit registered CB97, Silvermist, Tier 3, surveillance dog. The words hit like ice water. Surveillance. Shadow had been part of a program. Possibly Luna too. This wasn't just about Clara. This went deeper. Robert sat back stunned. Then his eyes went to the jacket. The note. The stain. And he realized what had to come next. The lake wasn't done giving up its ghosts. But this time, he was going to make damn sure someone listened. The wind was biting that morning, dragging the smell of iron and pine through the trees like something ancient had woken up. Robert drove the truck with one hand on the wheel and the other resting gently on Shadow's back. The dog sat in the passenger seat, body tense, ears forward, eyes pinned to the road, like he understood where they were going and why. They didn't speak, but the silence felt full. The vet clinic sat just outside of town, off a narrow gravel road lined with rusted mailboxes and tall dead grass. The sign read, Dr. Rebecca Linden, Veterinary Services, but the smaller words beneath it mattered more. Former military canine specialist. Robert pulled into the lot, engine idling. Come on, he muttered. Shadow jumped down from the seat before the door was fully open. Inside, the place smelled of disinfectant and dog biscuits. Faint classical music played on an old radio behind the counter. Rebecca came out from the back room in a lab coat dusted with fur and age. She was 50-something, built like a woman who'd been carrying others for too long. Her eyes caught his first, and then they dropped to Shadow. Her brow furrowed. You've got yourself a hell of a dog there. He's got a scar behind the ear, Robert said, voice flat. I think it's an implant. Rebecca walked around the counter without a word and crouched beside Shadow. He didn't flinch as she parted the fur with gloved hands and ran her fingers along the ridge behind his ear. She frowned, then stood. I need to run a scan. In the back room, Rebecca rolled over a portable diagnostic unit and placed a handheld reader near Shadow's head. The machine beeped, then blinked. Rebecca leaned closer. Her eyes widened slightly. Jesus. What? This isn't civilian, she said, tapping the screen. This is a Tier 3 tactical tracker. Government issue. Black budget. Not even used by police canines. This is military surveillance grade. And old. How old? She hesitated. Early 2000s? Maybe 2002? These were discontinued after they got exposed in that whistleblower leak. Robert blinked. And it's still active, she added slowly, scrolling through the interface. Most of these got wiped. But this one, the screen populated with a blinking map. One green dot, flashing. Robert leaned in. The GPS pin floated over a section of Silvermist Lake not far from the north shore. Rebecca tapped the coordinates. It's centered about 60 meters off the old boat ramp. Robert stiffened. Right near the shelf. What shelf? There's a drop-off, he said. Voice suddenly distant. Right around that mark. Steep drop. Local kids used to call it the pit. Said a plane crashed there back in the 70s. Bullshit, of course. But I dove it once. Real deep. Real cold. Rebecca looked back at the screen. That's where the signal originated. And hold on. She tapped again. The GPS view rotated, displaying depth. There's a heat signature, she whispered. Robert's mouth went dry. A what? Could be a buried battery, or... She didn't finish. The dot glowed brighter, like something beneath the water was still awake. Robert stepped back like the map had burned his hands. Rebecca looked up. You want me to deactivate the chip? He shook his head. No, I need to follow it. She watched him carefully. You think this has something to do with Clara? I know it does. She took off her gloves. Be careful, Callahan. You chase ghosts too long and they start chasing back. He drove straight to the ridge that overlooked the lake. Parked, stared. The water glittered in the morning light, calm and quiet, like it hadn't swallowed children and buried secrets. Shadow leapt from the truck and started down the hill toward the waterline. Robert followed. He stood there on the shore boots and the sand jacket tight against the wind. Shadow paced near the edge, nose twitching, body alert. Then Robert said the name out loud, without thinking. Carl Brogan. Shadow froze, then growled, low, deep, primal. Not a sound of annoyance, but one of memory. Robert turned slowly. You remember that name? Shadow didn't look at him, just kept his eyes fixed on the lake. Carl Brogan, once a respected officer, then a supervisor at Silvermist's emergency response unit. He was the one who called off the search. Robert remembered the exact words. We've spent enough resources chasing a ghost. If she's out there, she's gone. We need to think about closure. That had been the end of it. The day Clara was declared dead without a funeral, without a body, just a box of clothes and a folded report. Robert reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. Found the number in a buried contact list. Brogan, Sheriff Old. He hit dial. The line clicked, rang twice. Then a tired voice answered. Yeah, Carl. Silence. This is Robert Callahan. A pause. Then a sigh. Damn. I figured I'd hear from you eventually. I want to talk, Robert said, voice tight, about Clara. Long silence. Then I thought we buried that. You buried something, Robert snapped. Not my daughter. Brogan's voice darkened. Look, I don't know what you think you found, but I've got her dog. That shut him up. The second one, Robert added. Shadow. He's got an active tracker. It just pinged under the lake. Right where you said nothing was. You need to let this go, Brogan said, suddenly firm. You don't know what you're stepping into. Robert's grip on the phone tightened. You called off the search 2 days early. You rushed the paperwork. You lied to my face, Carl. I did what I had to. For who? More silence. Then quietly, don't call here again. The line went dead. Robert stared at the phone, then at the lake. Shadow had crept to the edge and was staring out at the water. Tail stiff, breath slow. Then he howled, a sound that tore through the morning like it belonged to something older than time. Robert had heard it before, once. The night Luna came back alone. That howl, long grieving, full of something that wasn't quite animal, had followed him into every sleepless night since. And now it was back. And it was aimed at something beneath the lake. Robert's hands trembled. He crouched beside Shadow, touched the wet fur behind his ears. I hear you, he whispered. I'm listening. Somewhere out on the water, something shifted. The wind changed. The lake, once smooth as glass, rippled slightly like something below had stirred. And Robert knew with chilling certainty that the lake hadn't finished with him yet. It was just beginning. The knock came just after midnight. Robert wasn't sleeping. The coffee had long since gone cold in his cup. He opened the door without checking the peephole. Shadow stood alert beside him, ears tilted, nose twitching. On the porch, bundled in a dark coat with frost clinging to her scarf, stood Officer Emily Torres. She was younger than he expected, early 30s maybe, but her eyes were sharp, shoulders squared like someone used to being underestimated. You Callahan? She asked, lifting her badge halfway out of her pocket. He nodded slowly. You're not the sheriff. Good, she said, stepping inside without waiting. Because the sheriff's office doesn't want me looking into this. Robert closed the door behind her. Shadow circled once, then sat in front of her, staring. Torres didn't flinch. Instead, she reached down and let him sniff her glove. He knows, she said. That lake did something to him. Robert poured her a coffee. No cream, no sugar. She didn't ask. I saw the GPS ping you logged, she said, sipping. I monitor old databases. Anything flagged as government issue tracking, especially animal implanted, goes through my desk. And this one led me back here. She pulled a folded brittle map from her coat pocket, laid it flat across Robert's cluttered table. It was yellowed with age, frayed along the folds. Shadow's ears pricked up as soon as it touched the wood. This, she said, pointing to the blue ink lines curling across the lake, is the original 1944 survey map of Silvermist, back when the lake was man-made. Robert leaned in. What are those? She traced a long, narrow vein etched beneath the lake's surface. Drainage tunnels, old supply lines. Military use during World War II. Cold War paranoia left them forgotten. Sealed in the 70s. Sealed, with dynamite, supposedly. Supposedly, she nodded. Most people don't even know this system existed. But this one here, she tapped a faded red mark just off the northern bend, ran directly beneath the current lake bed. Straight to the hills, where the old hunting lodges used to be. Robert stiffened. That's where the signal's coming from. Exactly. They stared at the map in silence. Torres broke it. I think those tunnels were reopened. Not officially. Not by the military. But someone used them. Recently. You think it's trafficking? Her jaw clenched. Kids disappear from counties all around here every year. Most get filed under runaway. But I've been building patterns. Clusters. Timelines. Robert didn't interrupt. Torres leaned forward. And your daughter wasn't the only one taken in 2005. Robert went cold. What? There were 3 other children in a 30-mile radius that spring. 2 girls, 1 boy. All under 10. All gone within 6 weeks. All drowned or lost in areas near deep water. The bodies were never recovered. Robert's voice was hoarse. Why wasn't that ever? because Brogan made sure it wasn't she cut in. He closed every case with the same phrasing. Presumed drowned. Insufficient evidence for foul play. And you? I don't presume, Torres said. I dig. She rolled up the map, took a breath. I want to go there. With you. With him. She glanced at Shadow. Robert hesitated, then nodded. They left before dawn. The lake was still wrapped in fog when they arrived. Torres had marked the GPS point on a rugged tablet mounted to her dash. Shadow whined the closer they got, low, desperate sounds that barely seemed canine. Robert had never heard anything like it. They parked near the forest line and moved in on foot. Shadow led, down past a line of twisted birch trees, across a frozen stream, to the lowlands that the modern maps didn't show. The air changed, heavier, colder, and then they saw it. A depression in the ground, white as a truck and ringed with dead grass. The earth looked wrong there, disturbed, but frozen over again. Like something had been unburied and then buried again. Shadow approached first. He didn't bark. He howled. A sound that cracked the stillness, made the birds in the trees scatter. Torres knelt at the edge, sweeping her flashlight along the perimeter. It's not natural, she said. This wasn't just erosion. Robert followed the beam of her light. Near the center of the depression, the soil had collapsed in a perfect circle. Ice clung to the inside like the edge of an open wound. He stepped closer. Torres pulled a portable scanner from her belt and swept it across the ground. Beep, beep, ping. Metal, she muttered, 5-6 feet down. Could it be a hatch? Could be a container? Could be a body vault. Whatever it is, it wasn't meant to be found. Shadow pawed at the ground, now growling. Something deep in his body recognized this place. He scratched harder, faster, then yelped and pulled back. Robert knelt beside him, blood on his paw. A jagged edge of rusted steel had cut through the dirt just enough to scrape flesh. Robert reached out, brushing soil aside with his hands. A shape emerged, rounded, bolted, corroded but unmistakable. A sealed door. Torres stared. Underground entrance, she said. Locked from the inside. Robert stood, wiped mud on his jeans. How do we open it? Torres didn't answer. She was staring off toward the lake now, lips parted slightly. Then she turned. You said Shadow remembered the name Brogan? Yeah, he might remember more. She pointed toward the lake. If the tunnels connect, then that door is not the only way in. Robert swallowed. You want to go in through the water. We don't have time to wait for warrants. If kids are still down there, if anyone is still alive. She didn't finish, because Shadow had already taken off. Straight toward the lake. Robert cursed, took off after him, and Torres followed. They reached the shore in seconds. Shadow stood at the waterline fur, bristling, barking madly at nothing. But then they saw it. Bubbles, large ones, surfacing in a slow column just offshore. Torres scanned the water with a thermal scope. There's a heat source, she whispered. Underwater. Moving. Shadow barked again, louder this time. But it wasn't fear. It was recognition. Robert's hands went numb. The lake had never let go of the past. It had just waited for someone to remember. And now, with Shadow leading the way, they were ready to unlock what had been buried for decades. Even if the door was locked from the inside. Even if what waited beneath the surface was never meant to see light again. The water closed behind them like a memory. Cold, black, and silent. Emily Torres clung tightly to the line tethered to Robert's waist as they swam out from the shore, their waterproof flashlights cutting through the murk. Shadow stood barking at the edge of the lake until they disappeared into the depths, then fell silent, watching. The sun was just rising, but under the lake time had no meaning. Only pressure. Only weight. Then through the haze of algae and sunken leaves, the outline of the boat emerged. Robert paused. Even in the cold, his chest burned. The ribs of the hull jutted like broken bones. The wood had darkened, warped, but held its shape like a relic, refusing to rot. They swam closer. The boat sat sideways, leaning into a slope of mud. Emily's light swept across its side, and both froze. Scratches. Inside, etched along the ribs of the hull, claw marks. Dozens of them. Desperate, chaotic. Evidence of someone trapped, fighting. She was in there, Robert whispered, air bubbling from his mask. Emily nodded grimly and pulled herself in. Inside, the sediment floated up like disturbed ash. Robert followed her in, and immediately something floated between them. A torn piece of red fabric. It fluttered lazily in the current, catching on a rusted nail. Emily caught it carefully. The texture, though water-worn, still showed the frayed edge of a child's shirt sleeve. And then Robert's light hit something near the bow. He swam closer, reached. It was a doll, half missing, bloated, its plastic limbs discolored by time. One of its eyes had been forcibly removed, a socket cracked like someone had ripped it out in terror or rage. The fabric dress, once pink, was now gray-green with moss. Robert stared at it, frozen, until Emily touched his shoulder. She held up a laminated paper, fragile but somehow intact inside a plastic pouch. Half of it was missing, but what remained made Robert's chest hollow. Medical intake form. Water blurred but still legible enough to read Clara Callahan, DOB 07-22-1998. Jesus, Emily whispered, mouth dry behind her mask. She didn't die here. Robert's hands trembled as he held the paper. Clara had survived. Long enough to be processed into some kind of system. Long enough for her name to be written down on official paper. Long enough to be alive while everyone believed she was gone. He couldn't speak. Not yet. Emily motioned to surface. Back on land. Shadow stood wagging anxiously. As soon as Robert and Emily stumbled out of the water shivering, he barked once, then ran. They didn't question it. They followed, down a narrow deer trail that veered off the road, overgrown and slick with frost. It led to a collapsed fence, and beyond it, a weathered hatch buried under vines and decades of silence. Shadow stopped in front of it, didn't move. Emily stepped closer, pushed the brush aside and found a metal handle partially rusted, welded into the ground. A bunker door, she muttered. Robert stared down, heart thudding. She pried gently. The hinges groaned. They descended slowly, flashlights in hand. The air was stale dead with age. The walls were metal-lined with old insulation, and damp crept up from the concrete floor. Pipes ran along the ceiling like veins. The passage turned once, then again, and then they saw it. A wall, flat, cold, metallic. But it wasn't the wall that stopped them. It was what was etched into it. Clara. The name was scratched deep. Dozens of times. In shaky, jagged strokes. Some letters overlapped, others were upside down. One version looked like it had been written by someone blind, bleeding, and all of them were carved with something small, blunt, and desperate. Robert reached out and touched the grooves. His hand shook, a small tremble. But then the full quake hit his chest. She was alive, he said hoarsely. She was alive. Shadow let out a soft growl. Not of anger, but sorrow. Emily scanned the walls. She must have been kept here. This is a cell. Robert backed up and turned. Behind them, another small room sat open. Inside, a rusted cot, a pile of child's blankets, and an old plastic bowl. He walked in, knees buckling. On the far wall, more writing. Some were words. Others were just scratches. One repeated phrase stood out. Dad will come, over and over. Sometimes misspelled. Sometimes scrawled like a prayer. Sometimes followed by tally marks, dozens. Hundreds. He dropped to his knees. Emily turned away, giving him space. I thought she was gone, he said, voice breaking. I buried her in my mind. I buried everything. But she never stopped waiting, and she had been alone, in the cold, beneath the lake. Not dead, just unwanted by the world, by the ones who were supposed to protect her. Emily reached down beside the cot and pulled something out of the corner, a child's drawing, faded, water-damaged, but still intact. It showed a little girl, a dog, and a tall man holding hands. Above them, home. Robert choked. She drew me, he said. She still believed I'd come. They stood there, in the silence of that hollow earth, surrounded by memory, grief, and the grotesque shadow of what had been hidden. Shadow whined. Emily turned to him. He led us here. He knew. Robert stood slowly, leaning on the wall, tracing Clara's name one last time. She was here, he whispered. She was here, and nobody listened. Not the sheriff, not Brogan, not even me. Emily touched his shoulder. But we're listening now. And we're not leaving her behind. From somewhere deeper in the tunnel, a sudden metallic clang echoed. Both froze. Shadow stiffened. Then came a faint cry, soft, strained, and barely audible. A child's voice. Alive. They didn't speak. They ran. The steel door moaned as Emily kicked it open. The sound echoed like a scream down the spine of the underground corridor. Inside, the air shifted. The room was cold, not because of the temperature, but because of what it remembered. Robert stepped in first. Flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam swept across peeling concrete, rusted bed frames, and the faint glint of something metallic bolted into the wall. A camera. Old, obsolete, but still wired. Emily stepped up beside him. They were watching. More than one camera. 3. All pointed toward a single metal bed in the center of the room, small child-sized, its mattress sunken with rot. All around the walls, the evidence of time passed in silence. Stacks of faded children's drawings, peeling alphabet stickers, broken toys, warped from moisture. A plastic chair leaned sideways next to a tray, bolted to the wall. This was a cell, Emily said quietly. A child's cell. Shadow whimpered. He moved slowly to the far wall and pawed at it. His nose nudged a section of the concrete like he recognized the scent of a ghost. Robert turned his light that way and stopped breathing. There carved into the cement were names. Dozens, all scrawled in a child's hand. First names only some spelled wrong, others crossed out. Each etched with a sharp object into the wall just above child height. Many had tiny hearts beside them. Some had nothing. Emily stepped closer. Her voice cracked. These kids were here. She reached for her phone, snapped a photo, then whispered the names aloud, like a prayer. Ellie, Marcus, Hannah, Z, Joy, Aaron. And one name was circled 3 times, in shaky, desperate repetition. Clara. Next to it, someone had drawn a crooked star. Underneath, still here, Robert's chest tightened until he couldn't breathe. The flashlight slipped from his fingers. She kept writing her name, he muttered. She didn't want to disappear. They moved deeper into the bunker, past corridors lined with rusted bunk beds. Old crates labeled in codes neither of them could read, and storage rooms that looked like they'd been cleared out in a hurry. This was operational, Emily said. Recently. Shadow suddenly froze in the next hallway. He gave one low growl, then turned sharply, bolting into the shadows ahead. Robert and Emily followed. The corridor narrowed. At the end, a flickering emergency light still blinked above a sealed chamber. The keypad beside it was broken, the metal scratched. The door was ajar. Inside, a small figure crouched in the far corner facing the wall. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. But Shadow walked in first, slow, careful. He lay down just feet from the figure and whined soft, like remembering a lullaby only he and the girl once knew. Robert's hands were shaking again. Clara, he whispered. No answer. Emily stepped in slowly, reaching out. We're here to help you. You're safe now. The girl didn't flinch, didn't speak, but she turned, just slightly, enough for the light to catch her face. And in that moment, Robert fell. His knees gave out. His heart fell through years of guilt and grief. It was her, Clara, alive, 18 years older, but still carrying the eyes of the child he lost. Eyes that weren't surprised to see him. Eyes that had waited, watched, remembered. She blinked, then finally moved. Only one word escaped in her mouth. Barely audible lips, cracked and trembling. Dad. Robert crawled towards her, hands trembling. I'm here. I'm here now. She didn't resist when he touched her arm. She didn't speak again. She only stared. And then for the first time in 18 years she cried. Not loud, not broken, but with a quiet, slow ache that rose from the deepest part of her soul. Shadow crept closer, resting his head on her lap. The girl didn't even flinch, because somewhere inside, she knew him, because he remembered her. Back on the surface, paramedics swarmed the lake road like ants over a wound. Clara sat in the ambulance, wrapped in thermal blankets and IV in her arm. She stared ahead blankly, speaking only when asked direct questions. Robert never left her side. Emily stood beside him as the medical team finished scans. She's malnourished but stable, one doctor said. No signs of fresh trauma, but she's severely dissociated. Her speech will return with time, if it ever fully does. Robert nodded numbly. She said, Dad, that's enough for now. He looked down at her. She held a doll in her lap, one of the old ones from the cell. Its eye was missing, its hair tangled. But she clutched it like a lifeline. Shadow sat at her feet. The doctor handed Robert a file. We ran blood work, cross-matched. It's her, sir. Clara Callahan, 18 years underground. And she never left this place. Emily leaned in. She's the proof. The living proof of everything buried. But Robert wasn't thinking about the trial. Not yet. He was thinking about how she looked at him. Not with blame, not with questions, just with a fragile hope that hadn't died, despite every reason it should have. That night, Clara slept in Robert's house, his home for the first time in 18 years. The same room, the same bed, the same window. Shadow lay beside her. Robert stood in the doorway, unable to cross the threshold, as if walking in would shatter the miracle. Emily sat at the kitchen table. We'll take this to the DA tomorrow. That list of kids, every one of them needs justice. Robert nodded. You think she'll speak again? Emily smiled. She already did. That's a beginning. He turned back to the hallway. In the silence from Clara's room came a small voice. Good night, Shadow. The words were broken, hollow, but they were hers. Robert sank to his knees in the dark. And for the first time in almost 2 decades, he wept not for what he'd lost, but for what was finally against all odds returned. The night wasn't silent anymore. Down by the mouth of the bunker, headlights snapped through the trees, too many for coincidence. Emily was the first to move. Her hand instinctively went to the firearm at her hip as she yanked Robert back into the brush. They're here. They're back. Robert clutched Clara's arm. She flinched, startled, but didn't resist. Shadow growled low in his throat. His hackles rose, black fur bristling in the moonlight. He didn't need a signal. He recognized the danger. The vehicles stopped just short of the shoreline. Men stepped out. Not law enforcement. They wore no uniforms, no badges, only intent. One of them held a blue folder, the same type Robert had once seen passed hand to hand in the sheriff's office almost 2 decades ago. He knew in that instant this was the network. Not a rumor, not a myth. And now it was wide awake. Emily pulled out her radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Torres. I have visual confirmation of armed intruders at Silvermist Bunker. Request immediate backup. Static, then silence. She tried again. No response. Signals jammed, she hissed. They came prepared. Shadow took 2 steps forward, then bolted. Shadow, no, Robert called out, but it was too late. The dog vanished into the darkness of the trees toward the bunker mouth. Gunfire cracked the night like lightning. Robert dragged Clara behind the overturned canoe. Emily returned fire blindly, forcing 2 of the attackers back toward the vehicles. We need to get her underground. No, Robert said, shaking. Not again. Not back into that place. Emily met his eyes hard. That's the only exit they don't know. A bullet shattered a tree branch above them. Clara screamed. Go! They sprinted, down the broken metal stairs, into the belly of the bunker again. The scent of rust and fear hit like a wall. Robert's flashlight danced wildly as they stumbled into the central corridor. And suddenly, Shadow was there. His muzzle was bloody, not his own. A piece of denim still hung from his teeth. One ear was torn, but he was alive. Barely. Emily raised her gun. We hold them here, no matter what. The footsteps above thickened. Then they were inside. The first man around the corner had tattoos on his throat and a silencer in hand. Shadow leapt before Emily could react, straight for the man's arm. The gun misfired into the wall. Screams. The attacker slammed Shadow into the concrete, but the dog did not let go. Emily shot him in the knee. He collapsed screaming. More came. Gunfire. The sound deafened the air inside the steel tunnels. Robert grabbed a rusted pipe from the ground and swung it with all the strength grief had sharpened. It cracked against the shoulder of another attacker just as Emily emptied her second clip. She turned to reload, and in that sliver of time, one man grabbed Clara. She didn't scream. She just froze, eyes wide. Her body remembered this too well. Shadow, already bleeding from the flank, charged again, but the man had a knife. The blade slashed across Shadow's chest, but the dog didn't stop. He bit into the attacker's wrist, dragging him down, refusing to let Clara be taken. Blood poured down his fur like ink. Emily shot once, twice. The man fell. The bunker echoed with silence. Just breathing. Broken, heaving, real. Shadow stumbled, legs trembling. Clara knelt beside him. Robert dropped to his knees, already crying. No. No, not now. Not after this. Shadow looked up at him, one eye already closed. His breathing slowed. Robert pressed both hands to the wound, trying to stop a flood that couldn't be stopped. You saved her, he whispered. You brought her home. Shadow whined just once, then stilled. Emily moved slowly forward. They're retreating? We wounded at least 3. They didn't expect resistance. Robert wasn't listening. He held Shadow's head in his lap. Clara placed her hand on the dog's chest, and in the softest voice anyone had heard from her, stay. But Shadow didn't. The hero of the dark had given everything, and now he rested. Outside, red and blue lights finally tore through the trees. Too late for the battle, but maybe not too late for justice. Emily walked toward the first cruiser with blood on her arms and tears in her eyes. Behind her, Robert carried Shadow's body, wrapped in his own coat. Clara followed. She didn't look back, because she didn't need to. She knew the worst was over. She'd lived it again, and this time she wasn't left behind. And in the silence that followed, a new chapter began. Not of forgetting, but of remembering with the truth. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and rain. Somewhere down the hallway, someone was crying, not from pain, but relief. Somewhere else, a machine beeped steadily, reminding everyone that life, even after silence, goes on. Robert sat on the edge of a plastic chair with hands that couldn't stay still. His knuckles were scraped raw. Blood was dry beneath his nails. It wasn't all his. Across the glass, Clara lay under thin white sheets, curled up in a position no 18-year-old should ever default to, knees to chest, arms wrapped around a pillow like it might float. Dr. Marlowe, a trauma specialist flown in from Portland, adjusted Clara's IV and whispered something in the nurse's ear. The nurse nodded and dimmed the lights. Robert hadn't said a word since they'd pulled out of Silvermist. Not in the ambulance, not in the elevator, not when they peeled Shadow's blood-soaked body from his arms. But now, sitting outside this room, the weight began to shift, not lift, just shift. Emily Torres approached her jacket, stained, her eyes sunken. She knelt down so they were eye to eye. She's safe now, she said. But Robert, we need to talk. Emily spread the evidence folder on a cafeteria table 2 floors down. Robert stared at the documents, though the words barely registered. They were thick with legal ink names. He knew initials he hated. Carl Brogan, Sheriff Linwood, Dr. Howard Easton. All of them signed off on a death certificate that had no body. Emily tapped the corner of one photo, a scanned logbook from 2005. This is the autopsy report that was supposed to be filed after Clara's disappearance. But there's no timestamp. No signature from a medical examiner. In fact, the name listed here, Dr. H. Easton, had his license suspended in 2004. He wasn't even practicing legally. Robert blinked. Then why did they? Because someone needed that report to exist. To close the case. Clara's disappearance threatened something bigger than we realized. Emily slid another sheet forward. The This one showed a land registry. The underground hatches you and I accessed, originally built during Wubby Woo as fallout shelters, but in 1998, they were repurposed. Owned temporarily by a shell company, guess whose name appears on the board? Robert didn't answer. He didn't have to. Carl Brogan. Emily finished. And 5 years later, Clara vanished near the same shore. Her dog never returned. Her case was closed in 72 hours. You know how rare that is? Robert looked down at his hands. I remember the day I got the call. They said a piece of her clothing was found. They said she drowned. But I never saw a body. You weren't meant to, Emily said. Back upstairs, Dr. Marlowe emerged from Clara's room. She looked both hopeful and exhausted. She's stable, she said softly. No signs of infection. No broken bones. But psychologically, Robert stood. She recognizes her name, the doctor continued. And yours. Robert froze. Do you want to see her? He nodded. And suddenly, he was 12 steps away from something he'd only seen in dreams and nightmares. The door creaked open. The room was dim, silent, except for the quiet hum of a heater. Clara's face was turned toward the window where the rain made soft ripples on the glass. Robert stepped in. She didn't move. Not right away. But then her fingers curled slightly. He took one more step. She flinched. I won't come closer, he said gently, his voice breaking like ice on a frozen lake. I promise. She turned her head. Her eyes were hollow, but behind them. Something flickered. She studied him, carefully, like remembering the outline of a dream. And then in a voice so hoarse, it was barely a whisper. Dad. He stopped breathing. He dropped to his knees where he stood. Yes, he choked. Yes, baby, it's me. It's Dad. She blinked once, twice, and the tears came without sound. I waited, she said. He reached out barely an inch and stopped himself. But she moved forward. Just a fraction. I tried not to forget, she said, but they didn't let us talk. They didn't let us have names. I never stopped looking, Robert said. Even when they told me you were gone. Even when they made me sign that paper, I never stopped. She stared at him. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she reached out and touched the top of his hand. It was all he needed. He folded over her fingers, like a man clinging to the edge of a cliff. His face pressed to her knuckles, tears soaking into the cotton band around her wrist. They stayed like that for a long time. Father and daughter, not reunited by sight but by voice, by memory, by something stronger than evidence or documents or declarations of death, by the thing that survives everything, love. Later that night, Emily walked out of the precinct with a USB drive in her pocket. The drive held everything, maps, photos, logs, names. She didn't give it to her captain. She gave it to a federal investigator waiting in an unmarked van sent by an agency that didn't answer to county politics. What happened down there, she told him, was more than a mistake. It was a system. And they used our silence as the perfect soil. The agent nodded. We've suspected for a long time. But without a survivor. You have one now, she said. And a witness. She handed over her badge. The agent blinked. You sure? Emily stared up at the night sky. No. But I'm done playing by their rules. She walked away. No applause. Just the sound of rain. Robert sat beside Clara's bed until sunrise. He told her stories she didn't remember. About her bike, her freckles, her first day of school. He told her about Luna, about Shadow. At the mention of that name, Clara looked at him for the first time with something fierce in her eyes. He stayed, she asked. He found me, Robert said, his voice breaking. Good boy, Clara whispered. He nodded. The best. And for the first time in 18 years, they both slept. Not peacefully, but not alone. Never again. The clinic was quiet except for the shallow rhythm of breathing, barely there, barely holding. Shadow lay on a padded blanket near the old wood stove. Rebecca knelt beside him, gloved hands moving slowly, tenderly, as if every second she delayed death was a second gifted. Outside, the wind pushed softly against the windows, as if the lake itself was exhaling. Robert sat close, one hand on Shadow's side, feeling the faint rise and fall. It had slowed. More space between each breath. More silence in between. He wasn't a dog anymore. Not just. He was a sentinel, a witness, a thread of fate too strong to break. Behind him, the door creaked open. Clara, her feet were bare. She wore a hospital gown, but someone had draped a flannel jacket over her thin shoulders. Her hair was loose, her eyes still wide, still unsure, fixed only on the figure on the floor. She stepped forward slowly and sank to her knees beside Robert. Her hands didn't tremble this time. Shadow opened his eyes at the sound of her voice, barely more than a whisper. Hi. He blinked. His tail twitched once. Clara reached out and laid her fingers along the back of his neck, just beneath the scar tissue, where the locator had been removed. Her thumb moved in small circles like she was tracing an old memory, a forgotten lullaby. I missed you, she said, and then quieter, and I missed Mom. Robert's breath hitched. Clara leaned in her forehead against Shadow's muzzle. Luna would have loved you, she whispered. You're her baby, right? Shadow's breathing quickened for a moment. He nudged closer, pressing his nose against her cheek. Robert couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He could only watch as the girl he thought he lost, and the dog he never knew he needed, shared something he'd never understand, an entire language, written in silence and blood and longing. Rebecca stood back, giving them space. Clara closed her eyes. Shadow sighed deep, long, as if emptying every story he'd carried for 18 years. The trauma in Clara's limbs seemed to melt for a moment. For the first time since she was found, she didn't twitch, didn't flinch, didn't brace. She breathed with him, and then he stopped. No sound, no last bark, no struggle. Just stillness. Clara stiffened. Robert reached forward, trembling. He pressed his fingers to Shadow's side. No rise, no warmth. And then Clara, fragile, feral, healing, began to cry. Not the panicked cries of a child in fear, but the low, keening sobs of someone remembering what it meant to love. To lose. Robert wrapped his arms around her. Together they cradled the still body. A father, a daughter, and a shadow that had bridged the space between them. Later, Rebecca stood in the doorway, eyes glistening, hands wringing the hem of her coat. "I've seen a lot of dogs die," she said gently. "But never like that. Never with so much presence." Robert nodded. He didn't trust his voice. Clara remained kneeling, stroking Shadow's fur. She hadn't let go. She didn't seem like she could. "Can we bury him?" she asked. "Of course," Robert said. "Near the lake." He looked at her. The same spot. She nodded. "Where Luna went." Dawn broke cold and clear. Silvermist Lake shimmered like nothing bad had ever happened. But beneath the surface, the truth still lived. The ghosts weren't gone. They'd just been heard. Robert dug with his hands first, then with a shovel. Emily had offered to come, but he told her no. This was theirs. Clara placed Shadow in the blanket she'd kept since the clinic, navy blue with little faded stars. She folded it once gently and knelt beside the shallow grave. The sky was pale gold. Birdsong cut across the stillness. She whispered something no one could hear. Then they buried him. Together, they placed a small wooden marker by the tree. Robert carved a name into it with his old rescue knife. Shadow, he kept his promise. Beside it, Clara added something else, using a piece of charcoal she'd found in the fireplace. A small heart. And beneath it, "Tell Mom I remember." That night, they returned to the cabin. They didn't speak much. Clara slept on the couch. Robert watched her for a while, her chest rising steadily, her lips parted just enough to draw air without fear. There would be therapy, trials, headlines, investigations. People would ask questions, dig up bones, send agents, frame reports. But tonight was just this, the sound of rain on the roof, the ghost of a dog sleeping near the fire. And somewhere, perhaps beyond the veil, a mother dog named Luna, lying beneath the stars, finally at peace, knowing her daughter was safe. And her son, her brave, stubborn, beautiful son, had fulfilled the only mission that ever mattered. Bring her home. The wind moved gently through the trees, as if whispering a lullaby only the lake could understand. Robert stood alone near the base of the weeping willow. The same willow where Clara had once thrown her first ball to Luna, laughing so hard she'd fallen backward into the leaves. It had been a lifetime ago. And yet when he closed his eyes, he could still hear her voice, a child's joy, untouched by fear. Now the earth was fresh with Shadow. He had chosen the spot with care, digging through roots and memory bearing. Not just the dog who saved his daughter, but the weight of 18 years of silence. The wooden marker stood simple and proud. Shadow. He kept the promise his mother made. Clara had helped him carry the wrapped blanket. She didn't cry as much as he expected. There was a calm about her, fragile but undeniable, like someone who had spent years surviving and now finally could begin living. She knelt next to the grave and placed a round, faded ball next to the marker. "My last toy," she whispered. Robert didn't ask where she'd kept it all those years. Some things didn't need words. That afternoon, they returned to the cabin. Sunlight danced on the lake's surface, and for the first time, Robert noticed that Silvermist looked less like a grave and more like a mirror, reflecting not the pain of the past, but the possibility of a future. Inside, Clara sat at the table, a notebook open in front of her, a pen in her hand. Her handwriting was slow, shaky, but deliberate. Robert stood in the doorway watching. She didn't look up as she wrote, "Shadow brought my father back to me. Not with barking, not with teeth, with silence, with patience, with hope." She stopped. Her hand hovered over the page. Then she added in smaller letters, "And I am not gone. I am still here. I am still me." She closed the notebook and rested her hand on top of it like sealing a pact. Robert walked over. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Clara reached out and took his hand. In town, the flags flew at half-mast. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, people were speaking openly about Silvermist, not the lake, but the truth buried beneath it. Emily Torres stood in front of the town hall, a microphone clipped to her lapel. She wore her uniform polished proud, but her voice trembled with something raw. "Years ago," she said, "this town lost a little girl. Or at least, that's what we were told. Silence. She wasn't dead. She was silenced. Hidden. Forgotten. But she survived. She fought. And a dog born of another hero brought her back. Whispers moved through the crowd like waves. Emily looked at Robert standing in the back beside Clara. He gave her the slightest nod. I've reopened every case tied to that lake, Emily continued. I promise you we will not forget again. Applause erupted soft at first, then louder and louder still. Tears ran down Robert's cheeks before he realized they were there. Clara leaned against him. Just a little, just enough. Later that night, under the wide and star-heavy sky, they walked back to the lake. Clara had asked to see it again, but not the surface beneath. Emily had given them access to a small police drone, a waterproof one with a camera that could dive. Robert held the controller, and together he and Clara watched the monitor as the drone sank below the black mirror of the lake. Through weeds and driftwood and forgotten relics, they descended. There it was, the old wreck. The tunnel entrance, the darkness. But now it wasn't mystery. It was memory. It had shape. It had name. It no longer owned them. Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. She bent down and tied it to a floating lantern, then lit the base. The paper caught slowly, glowing amber words dark against the firelight. For Luna, for Shadow, for every child still waiting. The lantern floated drifting across the water. It did not sink. The next morning, Robert found Clara in the garden behind the cabin. She had dug a shallow trench and was planting small sprouts wildflowers, she said. The kind that grew even through stone. Can I read what you wrote? He asked. She nodded, handing over the notebook. The first page had changed. This isn't the end. It's the start. My name is Clara Callahan. I was taken. I was buried. But I am not gone. I lived. And I will keep living. Shadow was born for this. And he did it. He brought my father back. He brought me back. Now I will speak, and I will not stop. Robert closed the book and sat beside her. You know, he said, I think Luna knew. Clara looked up. Knew what? That she wasn't coming back. That she had to send someone else. They were quiet for a long moment. Then Clara said, Do you think dogs can make promises? Robert looked toward the willow. I think they're the only ones who ever keep them. And beneath the soil near the lake, under the reaching limbs of the willow tree, lay the body of a dog, born of silence and purpose. He had no pedigree, no papers, no place in the world before he appeared. But now he had everything, a name, a legacy, a life remembered. And above him, in the sunlit clearing by the water, a girl and her father began to laugh, gently, awkwardly, like they were just learning how. They didn't laugh like people who had forgotten pain. They laughed like people who had survived it. And that, more than justice, more than truth, was the promise fulfilled. The air smelled different now, not of sorrow, not of loss, but of pine new paint and the faint unmistakable trace of puppy breath. Robert stood at the threshold of what used to be his prison, a small creaking cabin that had once housed nothing but guilt, grief, and ghosts. Now, it was painted white and light gray. Sunlight poured in through widened windows. Wind chimes sang at the door. A new sign hung gently above the front porch. Luna House, a sanctuary for the lost. A promise kept. The idea had come from Clara 3 weeks after Shadow's burial, on a quiet morning when they were drinking tea and watching birds. She had simply said, I want this place to save others, the way Shadow saved me. He hadn't needed more than that. He'd spent his life saving people. But it took the love of a dog and the strength of his daughter to show him what true rescue meant. The Luna House was more than a shelter. It was a bridge between two worlds, between fur and skin, between childhoods taken and voices reclaimed. It was a place where survivors 2-legged and 4 could relearn trust, relearn safety, relearn joy. The back room, once Robert's storage, had been turned into a therapy den. Soft blankets lined the walls. The floor was warm wood, scuffed and clean. On the shelves, toys, books, and plush dogs with missing eyes that children had sewn back themselves. And in the center of it all, Clara. At 22, she moved like someone learning her body again. Her words were still few, hesitant, but her eyes were alive now. She sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a small group of children. Foster kids, runaways, and 2 boys who hadn't spoken since being found hiding in a barn. Clara didn't force them to speak. Instead, she whispered to the dog beside her, Promise, sit. The small black pup, barely old enough to stay balanced on its oversized paws, wobbled and sat perfectly. The kids laughed, really laughed. One of the boys clapped. Promise wagged her tail. Clara reached out slowly, not toward the children, but toward Promise's chest. Good girl, she murmured. The room stilled. Then soft, almost broken, a little girl near the window repeated the words. Good girl. It was her first word in months. Clara looked up at Robert through the half-open door, tears in her eyes. Robert smiled. Promise had been born only weeks before Shadow's death. One of Luna's long-lost offspring, rescued by another shelter in a neighboring town, bred in quiet captivity, unknown to the world until now. She had the same black coat, the same piercing stare, but in her there was also something softer. Shadow had been born of purpose. Promise was born for healing. She followed Clara everywhere, slept at the foot of her bed, waited outside the therapy rooms, learned commands faster than any dog Robert had ever trained in his rescue days. And Clara, she'd begun teaching, not just dogs but kids, how to listen, how to breathe, how to feel safe again. One evening, as twilight painted the lake in amber, Clara walked the path down to the willow tree. Promise trotted at her side. Robert followed a few steps behind. The grass had grown back where they'd buried Shadow. The round stone marker remained. Someone, probably one of the kids, had tied a small blue ribbon around it. A few wildflowers had sprouted without anyone planting them. Clara knelt. Promise sat beside her. "Hi, boy," she whispered. "We're doing it, just like you wanted." The pup leaned against her. Robert watched as Clara pulled a new object from her coat, a silver tag. She placed it on the stone, engraved simply, "Promise you live in her. She lives for others." Inside Luna House, things were growing. A bulletin board tracked rescues, dogs and kids alike. There were drawings from children with words like safe home and herd. There were photos of families reuniting, of volunteers helping a new child learn how to feed a puppy without fear. Clara's journal grew fatter every day. She'd titled it Voices Underwater. In one entry, she wrote, "The lake didn't kill me. It held me. Until someone listened. Shadow did. Dad did. Now I will listen for the ones still whispering from the deep." At night, Robert sometimes walked the edge of the lake. The nightmares still came. Faint splashes, muffled cries. But now when he woke sweating, he had someone to call. And Clara always answered. Sometimes with words. Sometimes with just her presence. Sometimes with Promise lying between them, soft and breathing and warm. There was a ceremony that spring. Emily, now promoted to deputy chief, hosted it on the lawn outside Luna House. The town gathered, hundreds, maybe more. She stood at the podium and said, "This isn't just about tragedy. It's about what comes after. This place was once filled with silence. Now it sings. Because people fought to listen." She turned to Clara, and one young woman made sure the silence never wins again. The crowd stood, applauded. Some cried. Promise barked once, and Clara smiled. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Word spread. Families of other missing children came. Some found hope, some found closure. Others simply found a place to grieve. Luna House became more than a refuge. It became a voice. One afternoon, Clara received a letter. It was addressed simply, "To the girl who survived the water." Inside was a drawing. A crayon image of a child holding a black dog on a leash. The caption, "I didn't talk until I met Promise. Thank you for hearing me." Clara taped it to the wall next to her journal pages. She looked at Robert. "Dad," she said, her voice stronger than ever, "can we build another room?" He raised an eyebrow. "For more dogs? For more kids?" she said. Then added, "And maybe more promises." That night, the moon hung low over Silvermist. Promise lay curled at the foot of Clara's bed, twitching in a dream. Clara, now nearly whole again, leaned against the window, watching the stars reflect on the lake. Robert joined her, 2 mugs of warm cider in hand. "You ever think," he asked, "that this house was waiting for all of us to come back?" She nodded. "But not as we were," she said. "As who we became." They didn't speak after that, just watched as the lake shimmered, as if even the water now believed in second chances. The lake was quiet again. Silvermist, its name a lie and a truth all at once. The mist no longer choked the surface like a ghost, unwilling to move on. It sat gently now, like a breath held in reverence. A year had passed. Clara stood by the water's edge. She looked different, taller, a little stronger, but still carrying the silence of 18 years buried alive in the dark. Her hair had grown longer, tied in a loose braid. In her hand she held a faded red rubber ball, cracked at the seams, one her father had found in the attic weeks ago, and said, "You used to throw this to Luna until your arms got tired." Now she had someone new to throw it to. "Ready, Promise." The black puppy beside her wagged its tail furiously. Promise was smaller than Shadow, younger, more impulsive. But there was something unmistakably familiar in the way it tilted its head. Ears perked, gaze locked with hers. Clara threw the ball. It flew in a perfect arc, slicing the still air, landing with a soft splash. Promise bounded into the water with no hesitation, sending up droplets of sunlit spray. From a short distance behind, Robert watched. His hair had gone grayer, but his shoulders straighter. The burden he'd carried for nearly 2 decades had shifted, not gone, but no longer anchored to guilt alone. He carried memory now. He carried love. And for the first time in 18 years, he carried hope. He breathed in the scent of pine and water and wood smoke. Then he whispered, not to anyone in particular, but maybe to the ghosts, or maybe to himself. "I won't let anyone disappear again. Not under my watch. Not in this lake. Not in this town. Promise emerged from the water, victorious, ball in jaws, Dia whipping joy like a flag. Clara laughed, a real laugh, high-pitched and shaky, as though her body was still remembering what it meant to make sound out of joy. Robert's eyes shone. "Dad, did you see?" she called, turning toward him. Her voice was still finding its way through the rust of trauma, but each word she spoke was a reclamation. He nodded, stepping toward her every second. They walked together to the tree line, where the willow bent gracefully toward the shore, its roots deep and unmoving. Beneath it sat a smooth stone carved by hand, sealed with care. The inscription read, "Shadow." The dog who kept the promise man forgot. Clara crouched beside it, running her fingers along the letters. "She saved me," Clara said. "She found me," Robert corrected softly. "And she brought you back." Clara didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her hand rested on the stone, and in that stillness was everything left unsaid. Behind them stood Luna House, the old cabin reborn. Robert had stripped the rod-added light and opened it to the world. It had become a safe haven for lost children, for abandoned animals, for those who had fallen between the cracks of a world too busy to look back. Inside, the walls were covered in drawings, some childish and hopeful, others dark and jagged, all honest. One showed a girl with tangled hair hugging a black dog. Above her were words scribbled in block letters. "Home is not a place, it's who stays." Clara had written it. In the back of the cabin, she spent hours training Promise, teaching it not just to listen, but to comfort. She'd learned from Shadow's silent loyalty how a dog didn't need to speak to know what was needed. Promise lay beside children during night terrors. Promise sat still when a shaking hand reached out for the first time. Promise was healing in fur and breath. And every day, Clara added one word to her journal. Sometimes it was safe, sometimes water, sometimes just shadow. Each word was a step away from the dark. And Robert, he became something he'd never imagined present. He no longer stared at the lake each night, waiting for a ghost. Instead, he stood beside the children, and the dogs watched over them, not with fear, but with a quiet pride. One evening, as the sun lowered like a slow confession behind the trees, Emily Torres arrived. She had left the force a month after the trial. Carl Brogan had been sentenced along with 2 others, who had known, who had buried evidence, who had chosen silence over justice. Emily had chosen otherwise. She stood beside Robert now, looking out at the water. "She looks good," Emily said, gesturing toward Clara. "She's stronger than I ever was." Emily didn't argue. Shadow would be proud. Robert's smile cracked for a moment, tears unshed trembling in his voice. "She never left her." "Not really." "And neither did you." Clara came running up the hill. Promise at her heels. "We're doing sunset throws," she shouted. "You both have to play." Robert laughed genuinely. Emily nodded. Promise barked once sharply, as though calling out to the spirit of the lake, to the old pain, to say, "We're still here. We survived." The 3 of them took turns throwing the ball until the sun dropped low, painting the lake in hues of amber, an apology. As night began to gather, Clara sat beside the grave again. She opened her journal, wrote, "Shadow found me because she never gave up. Not even after I did." Robert sat next to her. "Do you remember the promise I made you the day you were born?" he asked. Clara looked at him curious. "You were tiny, loud, screaming like the world had already hurt you. I told you, no matter what, I'll always come find you." She looked at the grave, then at Promise, then at the lake. "You kept it," she whispered. Robert touched her hand. So did Shadow. A gentle breeze rolled in from the trees. The lake shimmered. In the final frame, the camera pulled back slowly, reverently. The family stood beneath the willow, the water glinting behind them, the stone grave catching the last of the sun. And then, fade to black, fade in. A plaque by the edge of the lake next to the path where visitors now walk each day reads, "To all the lost children. May the ones who love you never stop searching. May the ones who left you never sleep again." Beneath it, "This place is protected by the spirit of a dog who never forgot."